Punters Politics just hosted a debate between these two economists on immigration and housing. However, one of them, Leith Van Onselen, was acting in complete bad faith, misrepresented the facts, and exposed himself as a fraud. In fact, it is econ grifters like Leith which make debates about immigration and housing so murky and insufferable to begin with. So today, we're going to go through his arguments and see if they hold up. Leith Van Onselen is an economist who for the past 10 plus years has been running the blog Macro Business. But there's a little bit more to this blog than just Leith's opinions. Tied to it is Macro Business Fund and Super, which are essentially investment outfits that Leith co-runs. These invest in big corporations such as the big four banks. Thus, Leith's entire business model, what makes him profit, is investing in institutions which have worsened the housing crisis. He goes on property investment podcasts for the explicit reason to promote his business that worsens the housing crisis.
If you're an investor, well, you need to, you can rally against the Ponzi like I do on a daily basis, but at the same time, you still got to put your money somewhere. So you might as well, if you're going to get ripped off by it in your living standards, well, you might as well make $1 out of it to compensate.
This, however, directly conflicts with the sentiment expressed by Leith in the Punters debate.
I'm not an investor in Victoria. I couldn't care less. I own my house, but I don't care what it's worth. I've got 2 teenage kids. I don't want to see the price of it go up because I want them to be able to afford a house. So
Leith's business model, which he has promoted elsewhere, is precisely in the business of making his kids' future homes more unaffordable. We'll get into it more in a sec, but these blatant lies become ever more apparent the more you pay attention to what Leith says, does, and most importantly, where he puts his money. The first major point I think is worthwhile talking about, which is related to what we spoke about just now, is why Leith talks about immigration. Let's hear it.
We always hear about the negative gearing, capital gains tax concessions, the tax arrangements, which are obviously serious problems, right? But we don't hear the other side as much, so I tend to focus on the other side because it infuriates me that people always say this is a supply issue, not a demand issue.
This is blatantly false. Leith is lying to you here. When polled on the housing crisis, 39% of people said that immigration was a top reason why we're in such a mess. Leith has a point, right? That's a minority of respondents. However, for example, only 9% of respondents pointed the finger at the financial sector, at bank lending practices. Now, as we've established, Leith's a money man. If we follow Leith's money, we can see he used to work for former treasurer Peter Costello, specifically as his advisor on financial regulation. Given that only 9% of people seem to consider that credit created by financial institutions underpins all housing activity and a lot of housing demand, why not spend more time outside of a few fleeting short articles here and there critically examining financial deregulation? Leith's silence on demand underpinned by financial institutions is particularly important given during his time as federal financial regulation advisor, where things such as credit creation relative to GDP spiked dramatically, or non-bank financial lending, which is primarily driven by residential mortgage lending, also grew. But it seems that Leith only cares about one kind of demand, that being from immigrants, irrespective of how many people are talking about it and irrespective of the financial conditions that underpin all housing activity. This isn't out of ignorance. Leith later in the podcast, 40 minutes in, mentions once how banks intentionally crowd out commercial loans in favor of residential loans. So it is very clear that Leith is obviously and intentionally omitting key factors when talking about housing, only bringing up demand insofar as he can use it to scapegoat immigrants, therefore covering up the role of big financial institutions, of which he is a direct stooge. This leads into Leith's second point here.
The reason why I also focus on the immigration side is because I think the rental crisis is a bigger concern than high property prices, right? You inevitably push up rents, which is, to me, a much bigger concern than home prices. You then end up pushing more people into group housing, into homelessness.
Leith and his supporters will likely use this point about focusing on rent prices as opposed to property prices to justify his selective narratives, but this also falls completely flat. Hey, just in post here, but I forgot to mention the most obvious counter to this silly line of thinking, property prices and rentals are inextricably linked. The more expensive it is to buy a house, the more people you're going to push into rentals for longer periods of time, meaning upward pressure on the demand side on rentals. So obviously, you need to carry out both rent prices and property prices because they are inextricably linked. Leith opportunistically picks and chooses when he cares about property prices and when he cares about rent prices. Despite what Leith is telling you here, he has for years talked about property prices directly and conversely not mentioned rents at all. In one of his more famous interviews with Andrew Bolt in 2019, he says that Australia's high immigration levels have facilitated a situation where the housing market, property prices, must crash.
So the government's been propping up the economy, or the base figures, the headline figures, with a massive immigration level, which for many people is unsustainable when in their own lives, crowded streets and all that. We've had it propped up by a housing bubble, which is gone, a mining construction bubble, which is gone, and a government spending bubble, which can't keep going. Our future does not look bright.
Yeah, well, Paul Keating termed the phrase the recession we had to have in the early 90s. Well, I think this is the housing bust we've got to have.
Here in this 2017 article, which to his credit, is one of the few mentioning finance, and he says the following. My own view is that the debt explosion was the primary driver of house prices over the first half of the bubble, but the population Ponzi, read immigration, has been the primary driver over this decade. Compare that very affirmative statement to Leith's cowardly backing off of the issue of property prices in the Punters debate.
You inevitably push up rents, which is, to me, a much bigger concern than home prices.
So it's very obvious that Leith masquerading as only caring about rents is complete bullshit. It is a flat out lie. He will weaponize whichever statistics he can and try and lazily slap it next to migration numbers when it suits his narrative.
I will admit that home prices are affected by a whole range of factors, interest rates, a whole bunch of other stuff, tax concessions. Immigration is just one part of it. But when it comes to the rental market, it is the fundamental interplay between supply and demand that pushes up rents.
Leith posits himself as an experienced, seasoned economist, but this statement either shows a complete infantile view of economics or just exposes his lying for what it is. See, the new Leith, the one that can't use property prices today to justify his narrative, argues that house prices are affected by things like interest rates, tax concessions, little bit of immigration. But the population Ponzi, read immigration, has been the primary driver over this decade. Compare that very affirmative statement to Leith's cowardly backing off of the issue of property prices in the Punters debate. But the rental market, that's just supply, houses, and just demand, immigrants, nothing else. If you have like an inkling of any knowledge of economics, or if you've been to a single high school class, you'll know that this is just a silly, nonsensical distinction. The housing market, the property market, is also an interplay between supply and demand. That's just how that works. Things like interest rates, tax concessions, immigration may or may not change or shift that supply or demand. Tax concessions may stimulate demand, for example, but it's not its own variable on a supply-demand curve as implied by Leith here. If you're interested, this idea of a perfect equilibrium has been weaponized by the mainstream economics profession for literally hundreds of years. You can read more about it here. The same is true for the rental market. For example, interest rates going up means it's more expensive for landlords to service their mortgage, and therefore they might put rent up. We can see the effect here. Interest rates begin to rise in May 2022, and likewise CPI rents, which means the entire rental market, increases as well. But as you can see here, advertised rent, meaning rent for new listings advertised on the market, began to increase significantly earlier in 2021. Throughout 2020 and 2021, the population actually declined. More people left Australia than came here. Thus, the onset of the upward trend in rent prices cannot entirely be or mostly explained by immigration, as Leith would have you believe. He is intentionally lying to you.
Rents have surged. I don't know where he's coming on that. That has just been flatlined. That's just plain wrong. Cotality's latest quarterly rental review showed that rents have surged by over 40% in the last 5 years.
This is a quick one, but it gets to the heart of Leith's dishonesty. The other economist Leith is debating, Matt Grundhoff, made the point that over the long term, rent has generally been in line with inflation.
But interesting. So if we go over the longer term, rents have basically been increasing with the general inflation level. So again, taking that since 2000 for the last 25 years, the general CPI, how we normally measure inflation, has increased by 103%. So it's doubled. Rents have increased by 115%, so slightly more.
Which, yes, Matt is absolutely correct. In the long run, real rent prices, meaning rent accounting for inflation, rose by around 22% between 2005 and 2015. They then fell every year to 2022. Real rents were 9% lower in 2022 than in 2015. So then what was the level of immigration in that same time period? Immigration was constant at over 200,000 every year prior to COVID, where real rent prices were actually falling. But according to Leith's graph here, which you've probably seen a million times, it's one of the more popular ones, that was an undesirably and abnormally high amount of immigration. Yep, nothing about rents back then. To further drive this point home, let's compare 2 points in time in Australia's rental market, 2014 and 2023. According to a graph Leith posted himself, Australia's dwelling completion per 100,000 is at the same level as it was in 2014. However, rents grew in 2023 8 times more than they did in 2014. In both periods, Leith was spruiking his population Ponzi bullshit, but only in 2023, only in the latter year, was he talking about rent, despite the level of supply and the level of demand being the exact same in these 2 years. And again, it's not some far left woke source. He posted this himself. This clearly demonstrates Leith's rank opportunistic tendency to exploit loan statistics to suit his narrative and to completely mischaracterize people who disagree with him. But okay, let's get at the heart of the issue. Why have rents increased so dramatically in the post-war period?
Cotality's latest quarterly rental review showed that rents have surged by over 40% in the last 5 years, and the median Australian renter now is paying $10,500 more per annum on renting than they were at the start of the pandemic. And if you actually chart, rental growth versus population growth, it almost tracks 1 for 1, or immigration even.
Leith is absolutely correct. Rents have surged in the past 5 years. But his over-reliance on amateur and inaccurate correlation-causation games is indicative of his infantile analysis. So let's take a look at when rents in Australia began to uptick. A common talking point on the right is that rent prices flatlined during COVID because there was a net negative population growth. But what isn't mentioned at all is the substantial increase in rental regulation and controls in 2020, which made it way more difficult for landlords, if not illegal, for them to up the rent. Moreover, interest rates were low, electricity prices had fallen. Thus, to chalk up the stagnation in rent prices simply due to net negative immigration is inaccurate and dishonest. Furthermore, individual states and territories tell radically different rental market stories. Let's look at the ACT, which retained many of the rental regulations and controls that other states ditched after COVID. The ACT has had similar population growth to New South Wales and has very similar vacancy rates, but these two states and territories tell a very different rental story. Rent prices and incomes in the ACT stayed relatively similar, with rent prices just outpacing incomes by 1.4 percentage points in 5 years. It's alright, room for improvement. But then when we swing over to New South Wales, the jump in rent prices is substantially more dramatic, particularly compared to incomes. Rents in New South Wales jumped 33 percentage points more than incomes. These markets had similar population growth, similar vacancy rates, and so according to Leith's dumbed down infantile narrative, all that should matter is that fundamental interplay between supply and demand. The difference? The ACT has a government that's willing to at least somewhat tinker with the unequal distribution of resources to rein in Australia's highly privatised rental market and bring it to some sense. Unlike those who forecast rent controls would end the world, the ACT shows that sensible rent regulation can stave off excessive rent hikes that we've seen in other states, which again is despite having the same level of population growth and the same level of vacancy rates.
This whole notion that you can massively ramp up the population and not have an impact on the rental market is just farcical.
Clearly, Leith is the one being farcical. We'll finish today by touching on the actual academic literature on housing and immigration, because it exposes Leith for not really being an economist. Real economists try to make models, they try to account for variables by doing things such as regression analyses, but Leith is trying to sell you a narrative because remember, he has his investment manager fund directly tied to his anti-immigrant blog. They're the same brand. Why would he spend all the time, effort, and resources to actually get good peer-reviewed research published on the topic if he can instead just grift his way into far-right notoriety? The reason why it's actually a little tricky to calculate precisely how much certain things impact housing, namely immigration, is because of what's called endogeneity. Essentially, immigrants may choose to live in areas where rents are already falling or rising, so the effect is ambiguous. Fortunately, economists came up with this tool called a shift share. Without getting into the weeds too much, if you want to read more, check this out. But this model is able to make the immigrant variable exogenous and therefore measure its effects on the market, controlling for other variables. Moalemi et al. 2023, using this, then employed a regression analysis which essentially isolates the relevant exogenous variable, that being immigration, and its effect on rent price growth. To quote the findings of the paper, a 1% increase in the population due to immigration leads to a 0.7% increase in rents. 0.7%. For context, Australia's annual population growth, which is more than just immigration, is just above 2%. Therefore, it is true that immigration has contributed somewhat to rents going up. However, the amount rents have been pushed up by immigration, per this formula, is actually less than wage growth. That is a far cry from the unsubstantiated and untrue estimation given by our fake economist friend over here when asked about how much he thinks immigration has contributed to rent prices going up.
Right, so for the rental market, I'd say at least 75%.
By aggrandizing immigrants as this ever-present evil responsible for everything, elites and their minions, like Leith Van Onselen, ensure that the real problems with housing and immigration are never going to be addressed. So look, if you want to keep believing the very obviously bought and sold grifter talking points from a literal investment fund manager, that's your prerogative. But when it comes to what actually impacts people's lives, people's housing situation, this video has made it clear, abundantly clear, that we have a distribution problem, not a scarcity problem.